Hello everyone, my name is Nick and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program 2. You may be wondering, why are you in Microsoft Paint? And the answer is, today we're going to be learning how to build your very first rocket in Kerbal Space Program 2. So I'm assuming you have absolutely no experience. You might not even know what a rocket is. You just saw something shiny and bright flying up into the sky and you said, I want to make one of those. And we're going to start today by explaining just a little bit, not too much, I promise, theory about how rockets work and how to build them for certain objectives to help you better understand what you're trying to make. So, first, let's start off with your rocket. Here it is. It's a very nice rocket. We got to add a little fiery tail here. Yes, rocket go fast. So, your rocket has thrust in this direction and only this direction. That is your thrust. When you design a rocket in Kerbal Space Program 2, you're given a value in the bottom right, and that value is your delta V, which literally stands for the change in velocity that your rocket is capable of producing. So when you build rockets, the actual engine, so that's this bit down here, I'll do a little arrow, the engines are rated based on their specific impulse, so ISP, and you can think of that as a measure of power. Now, stick with me here. What impulse is the amount of change in momentum that something produces over a given interval of time. So, we'll call this your delta meaning change, momentum. Ignore my horrible mouse handwriting. So that's your specific impulse. That's basically how much can you change the momentum of the thing that you're moving. And momentum, if we understand what that is, momentum is the product of velocity, V, and mass, little m. Actually, typically we represent momentum with the letter P. So I'm going to correct that here. Yes. The letter P. Oh my gosh. I don't even know how to use Microsoft Paint. There we go. Letter P. Okay, so to review. Specific impulse is equal to the change in momentum that something can provide, an engine specifically. And then momentum is equal to velocity times mass. So we're either changing the velocity of something or its mass, and that results in a change in momentum. So essentially what a rocket engine does is it burns fuel to change the velocity of the object, and by burning fuel it also changes the mass. So that's a basic understanding of what a rocket engine does. Now when you design a rocket in KSP2, what you're generally going to look for is your delta V value. We'll circle that in green. So you want to shoot for certain values of delta V depending on what your objective is. In this example, we're just going to try to get into orbit, and the game actually will give you a calculator for how much delta V you need. But to get into orbit, you need roughly 4,000 delta V. And remember, delta V stands for change in velocity, and it's measured in meters per second. So this is essentially 4,000 delta V is how much power, how much ability to change velocity we need to get into orbit. Now the way that you design rockets most efficiently, not only in Kerbal Space Program 2, but in real life, is using stages. So say we have this rocket engine, right? This is our rocket engine. And we have this much fuel, which is the, say, methane in methalox. And then we have this much oxidizer, which is the oxygen. And then we have our actual nozzle down here. So what happens is, and again, this is super simplified. It's not actually like this, but the oxidizer and the fuel are mixed, and they combust, and the exhaust gases are pushed outward of the nozzle, and that is what produces the thrust. So what happens is Once you've burned out all of this oxidizer and fuel, you still have this heavy casing, but it's not giving you any additional thrust. So what you do is you add stages. So we put one engine down here, and then we put a separator, which I will go into in the video, and then we put a second stage here, and you could put as many stages as you want, maybe a third. If you're familiar with the Saturn V, which is like the most iconic rocket of all time, or even the space shuttle, you'll observe that sometimes they have boosters on the side. Boosters are just side-mounted stages. They have separators as well. So you choose the number of stages based on what you're going to do, and typically you keep in mind what you want to do with each stage. So for our first stage, typically that's our like ascent stage, so we'll label that an A. That's supposed to take us most of the way up to the upper atmosphere. And then we have our orbiting stage, which is to actually get us into a stable orbit. And then we have our deorbiting stage, letter D, and that is to get us back down. You need progressively less power as you go up the stack. And the reason for that is as you get further off of the Earth's surface, or whatever planet you're leaving from, there's less gravity, and the atmosphere is a lot less thick, so you encounter less resistance. So, this probably makes absolutely no sense, but more important than theory is reality. So what we're going to do now is go into Kerbal Space Program 2, and I'm going to show you how to build your first rocket and what to consider when you're doing it. So welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are in the wonderful world of Kerbal Space Program 2. So this is your vehicle building interface here. This is where all the magic happens. So first, we're going to go through the important components of a rocket, and then we're going to build and test one and show you how to get your first rocket off the ground. So obviously where you want to start with any rocket is the cockpit. So you're going to want to choose a command pod. So that's under this tab here. You can choose any one of these. You don't really need to go too crazy for your first rocket. The tin can is always a solid choice. It's just a single-seater. And you just click on that, and that brings it into our actual assembly area here. And you'll notice some things about this. When I mouse over it, you'll see this little node on the top here. That indicates an attachment point, so something can go there. In this case, typically a parachute if you'd like to return alive. Optional, though. And on the bottom here, we have another attachment node. So this is our tin can. And you can see in the bottom right here, we have our delta V, which is currently 0 meters per second, because we don't have any engines yet. And we need to fix that right away. So lucky for us, there's no heating yet in Kerbal Space Program 2. But what you would normally do, and what we're going to do for the sake of the video, you're going to add a heat shield. And you can just click on that and place it right here on the bottom of the craft. Now the reason that that's important is because when you're returning to Earth, returning to Kerbal in this case, this is going to get very hot. The heat shield gets hot instead of the pod to save your Kerbals from being incinerated, which, if you're a good captain, is what you want. So next, we're going to go to this tab here. This is your couplers. So this is how you separate different stages in the game. So like I was explaining in the theory section, you have different stages for different parts of the mission. And for each of those stages, you click on a decoupler, and you add it here. And the game automatically, oh boy, it automatically adds this sort of skin in between the part in front of it and the coupler. So now we're ready to add our first engine. Now, importantly, there are two types of engines that you can use both in this game and in real life. The first one is solid fuel, so I'll find an example of that here. So say this one, the hammer. We can see in the statistics here, we have the max impact, we have the actual mass of the part, we have the impact tolerance, and then you can see towards the middle of the statistics there's the max thrust at 1 atmosphere, which means how much thrust in kilonewtons is this providing, like as soon as we launch it on the ground, and then the max thrust within a vacuum. So how much thrust is it providing in the vacuum of space? And then you can see ISP1 atmosphere, which is the specific impulse, again, at launch. and you can see ISP vacuum, which is the specific impulse in space. And the unit of that is seconds. So anyway, solid fuel boosters, so you put one on here, they are unable to be throttled. They are either on or off, and once you turn them on, they do not turn off. And they're typically used for first stages. The boosters on the side of the space shuttle missions are solid fuel boosters, but we're not going to use one of those just yet. What we're going to use first is a liquid fuel setup. So for liquid fuel, start by clicking on this fuel tanks tab here. What you're going to do is you're going to find one of these fuel tanks, and since we have a small command pod, we're going to look for a small fuel tank because the SM label denotes the thickness of this part, or the diameter of this part. So if we were to pick out a medium part here, you'll see it's considerably bigger, and a large part, and so on. You get the point. And there are, of course, adapter pieces for that. So if I wanted to go from small to medium, I can use this piece. Where did it go? Here it is. Yeah, and then I can put them... Well, this is small, but I can put the medium on there. But we don't need that much for this video. So what you do first is you choose a fuel tank. And you can see at the bottom of the statistics list, it says methalox. That indicates how much fuel these are holding. So we're going to pick this one. Just because. And you can see our delta V is still 0. And you ask, why is our delta V still 0? Well, the answer is simple. There's no engine. There's no combustion happening. So next, we go to our Engines tab, and we choose one of these many engines. And there are a lot of things to be considered here, but we're going to break it down in a simple, accessible way. So there's a couple important things that you need to look at. One of the first things is, if you look, so I've moused over this engine here, just under the name of the engine where it says LV1000 Cornet, you can see it says Deep Space Methalox Engine. So if we go down the statistics list and we look at the specific impulse at 1 atmosphere versus the specific impulse at vacuum, we can see this engine is much more effective in a vacuum. So we wouldn't want to use this engine in our first stage because it's not as effective in an environment where there's an atmosphere. So what we're going to want to use in our first stage is an engine such as the Terrier. The Terrier, well, I believe, actually, let me check here. So actually, no, the Terrier is not a good example. You would want, so you see this one says it's a sustainer. So a sustainer is once you get off the launch pad and you're moving, your sustainer is what you fire for a long burn to get you up to orbit. So I believe there is one more type. Or perhaps there is not. Oh yeah, here we go. So see how this says launcher? That means that would be good for our first stage. Because that's good for getting us off the launch pad. But when you build the staging for a rocket like this, and you think about it, we've started at the top here. So this fuel tank that we put on here is going to be the last stage. So what we're actually going to want is a deep space or orbital engine. So the Terrier is actually perfect for this stage because it is orbital. It has a lot more ISP in space than it does at atmosphere. So we're going to put a Terrier engine on the bottom of this stage. Next thing we have going on, this is one complete stage. So we have at the top a decoupler, and then a fuel tank, and then an engine. To start our next stage, we go back to decouplers, and we put another one on the bottom. Now, we want to set up our sustainer system. So what I'm going to do, and actually before I do this, you'll notice our delta V has now gone up significantly to 3,280, which is pretty good. But our second stage here is going to be our sustainer. So I'm going to get another Methalox fuel tank, pretty big one. And I'm going to go back to our engines and pick a sustainer engine. So we can just use this one, the LVT45 swivel. And you'll see that has again brought our delta V up significantly. So, I would technically this is all you need because our delta V has now reached 4,518, which is enough to get to orbit. But to demonstrate what else you can do, I'm going to add one additional stage. So, if we go back to our decouplers, you can see we also have this category called radial decouplers. Radial decouplers are mounted, so I choose the small one, for example. They are mounted on the side of your ship. So like I put one here, and then I can go over to, say, my solid fuel boosters, grab one like this. That's actually quite big, so I'm just going to grab a smaller one. And I can place this booster on the side of this decoupler, right here. And you'll see if I look here that there's an offset there. And that allows us to decouple this booster when it's been spent, so we're not lugging all that dead weight to orbit. But I'm sure you're thinking, this is a very asymmetrical design, it's not going to work like that. So what we can do is remove this, put it off in space for a second, and in the bottom middle here, we have symmetry mode. So currently it's on 1, which means no symmetry. If we click it once, we get 2. So imagine that this is a top view of the rocket, like this. That means that if I take this thing and grab it here, and I put it on this side, it's going to be mirrored on the opposite side. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Now if I wanted to add more boosters, I could put it on 3 or 4. And just like we just did, I'll demonstrate again. Now we have 4, which we do not need. 4 is excessive. It goes all the way up to 8. And then, so let's put it on 2. Side mount our boosters here, and these are actually mounted crooked. I'm going to fix that real fast. There we go. Okay, that should be fine. I am going to move this over just because it's bothering me that it's not aligned properly. There we go. Okay, so you'll see now our delta V is at 5,170 meters per second. More than enough to get us where we need to go. So, now, we need to add the bells and whistles, as I like to call it. So obviously, we want to recover our command pod at the end of the day. You cannot recover a command pod without a parachute. Ask me how I know. I've killed many Kerbals. So if we click on this tab here, Utility, Parachutes and Quality of Life, we can see the different options here, and there's 2 types. There's Parachute, you can see that just under the name, and there's Radial Mount. So for the radial mounts, they go on the side of a craft like this. But for the non-radial mount, such as this one, we can put it right on the top here, right on that connection node. Nice and neat. Oh, there we go. And now we have a parachute. So now we've implemented a way to safely return our Kerbals to the planet. But there are still some things we need to add to this craft before it is airworthy. So, one of the things that will happen is when you are driving, quote unquote, your spaceship into orbit, you're going to need to adjust its heading. You're going to need to rotate it in all sorts of different directions. There's a couple ways that you can do this. For one thing, if we look at our engines, some of the engines, such as this one, have a gimbal, which means the actual cone of the engine, this bit, can be rotated to different angles to provide thrust at different angles. That relies on using your fuel, so there are some alternatives. For one thing, the command pods all come with an integrated reaction wheel system, which if we look under utility, those are right here. And a reaction wheel system essentially spins some wheels inside and causes your craft to rotate by doing that. It uses, I think, gyroscopes, reaction wheels, obviously. So on a craft that has a command pod like this, you don't necessarily need one. But if you wanted to put one, what you could do is you could take off this this part here, so the entire rocket. You could stick one in this stack here, and then just connect it right back up. maybe. There, yeah. Just like that. So now we have our reaction wheel unit here, which lets us reorient the craft once we're in the air. But we don't really need one for the purposes of this mission, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Another option for stability control and reorienting is the RCS system. And these are literally just tiny thrusters. They are a great way to help stabilize crafts, but the thing about them is they need a fuel source. So let's say I've put 2 on my rocket here. We need to go to our fuel tanks, and we need monopropellant. RCS thrusters work on monopropellant. So I could do something like this, but as you can see, we've harmed the aerodynamics of our rocket quite a bit by doing that. So that is most unfortunate. I typically do not use RCS systems, especially on small crafts, but it's totally up to you how you manage to do that. Now, the final thing that we need to add to this craft is aerodynamics. So, because of this parachute, we have a nice nose cone on our command pod, but we do not have anything on these, and they're going to create a lot of drag. So we go to our aerodynamics section where you can find wings, and then we scroll down here. You can see the different size nose cone options here. So these parts are small, so we can pick any one of the small nose cones, such as these, and place them there. And there's our rocket. She's all ready to go to space. We have a delta V of 5,387, which is more than enough. We have a place for the crew. We have a parachute to recover the crew, and we have engines and separators to do it. Now, the final thing we need to talk about before we launch, and you should always do it in here instead of on the launch pad, is staging. So every time you press the space bar in Kerbal Space Program, you enter the next stage. You see on the right here, this is our staging. So 1 is first. The number indicates the number of the stage. And then the items within are what happens when you reach that stage. So for example, the way that this is working, in the first stage, these solid boosters fire. You can see them highlighted in green. Then when I hit the spacebar again, the radial decouplers will separate the solid boosters off from the ship. Then our liquid fuel engine at the bottom is going to fire. And when that is done, the next decoupler will decouple. And then our second liquid fuel engine, the Terrier, will turn on. And then, so right now in the final stage, not only is it going to detach the command pod from this fuel tank, but it's also going to activate the parachute. Now we don't want that, because if you activate the parachute too soon, it burns up in the atmosphere. So to create a new stage, you can see this plus button available to us right here. That would create a new stage below this one, but we want one after, so we're going to do that. And then we're going to move the parachute into its own stage. So now we are all ready to launch. So welcome to the launch pad, ladies and gentlemen. This is where all the fun stuff happens. Lots of things blow up, lots of Kerbals die, but Valentina knows that she's going to go to space today. That's why she's smiling so big. So let's go over some of the basics that we have going on here. So the left is what's called your nav ball. So the ball in the middle indicates your heading, and blue indicates sky, brown indicates ground. And then on the right here we have our altimeter. On the left we have our velocity meter, which is effectively a speedometer. This button is SAS. With that enabled, your craft will automatically work to stabilize itself on its current heading. Now, you can see with SAS turned on, all of these buttons become colored, which means I can use them. These buttons are different headings that we can choose for SAS to try to adhere to. For example, up, or prograde, which means align the vessel in the direction of its current velocity. So if we were going straight up, prograde would align us straight up. And then retrograde is exactly opposite the direction of our current velocity. And then of course there's down, north, and south. When we launch rockets, we basically want to launch, we want to pitch 45 degrees to the east, and then we want to wait for our apoapsis, which is this number right here, to exceed 70,000 meters. The apoapsis is essentially the highest point in the orbital arc of a rocket. Once our apoapsis exceeds 70,000 meters, we are in position to do our second burn, which will get us into a stable orbit. But it will be better if I just demonstrate that in orbit than try to explain it down here. So without further ado, let's get this thing off. So, begin the countdown. Okay, we'll just get straight off. So, we're going to begin by pitching east. So, in my case, that is the D key because I'm using WASD controls. The sooner you can get pitched east, the better. We can see our apoapsis, going up, and that is, again, the peak of our orbital path. So let's attach those next.
Okay.
Now, this is a swivel engine, so we're going to get significantly more ability to control our attitude out of this engine. The thing is, though, make sure you make your control inputs very gently. Do not go crazy with it, because the rocket will remind you that it is not in your control and it's just letting you play with it for a little while. Okay, so I'm going to pause so we can demonstrate here. You're going to hit the M key, and this map is going to come up. This is a map of Kerbin and your craft on Kerbin. So you can see here we have our little rocket that we've just made, and this is our orbital trajectory. The apoapsis is labeled right here. That is our current highest point. So right now we're just going to keep burning until we reach 70,000 meters or more on the apoapsis. So that is exactly what we're going to do. Let's play here. You can, if you're short on fuel, you can throttle your engine down a little bit to kind of just sustain your current speed. We have more than enough fuel. And as you can see in the bottom right, our delta V is changing as we go. And the reason for that is because we are burning fuel to get up here. So obviously our delta V is going down. Because the circumstances are changing. You can see our apoapsis is gradually increasing. However, it's a little too gradual for the likes of me, so we're gonna burn this thing, get us even higher here. And we're running a little low on fuel, so this stage is about to burn out. Okay, so we separate and we activate our next stage. Now, the Terrier engine consumes very, very little fuel, so we're going to be able to burn this thing for a very long time. And what we're going to do is we're going to wait for this apoapsis number to get up to 70,000. You can see we've got plenty of fuel left. We still have 3,200 delta V. Everything is going well so far. Knock on wood. What you'll see now, so our apoapsis has just exceeded 73,000 meters, so I'm going to shut the engine off. So, another theory moment here. What we're going to do, essentially, and this is a little bit of orbital mechanics, so if it doesn't make sense the first time, it didn't make sense to me the first time either, but try to rewatch it a couple times and hopefully it will click. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait for the craft, labeled here, to reach the point of apoapsis, or shortly before it. And then we're going to orient the craft perfectly prograde. So that means essentially pointing this way, like outwards. And then we're going to do a burn right at apoapsis. And what that does is it takes this orbital trajectory and it expands it outwards so that our craft is going further and further out of the planet until eventually we have, rather than a crashing trajectory, an orbital trajectory. And that means we achieved our goal. So, for this part of the mission, it's best to, you can stay here and watch your actual altitude versus your apoapsis, or you can use this map mode. If you think you're really fancy, you can use the time skip thing, but that usually just ends up causing problems for me. But we're going to use it today anyway. So to orient your craft prograde, you got a couple options. One of them is to do it manually, so you can use your WASD keys. which I will do for just demonstration's sake. Or, if you have your SAS system, you can hit the prograde button, and the craft automatically orients itself in the prograde direction. Now, if we look here, we are just about to get to our apoapsis, so let's begin our burn. And you will see as this line gradually expands outward around Kerbin. Now, I've started this burn a little later than I probably should have because of the Terrier engine, but you can see as we gradually are getting that orbital line further out, and I'm actually going to adjust by pointing just a little bit skyward to raise our apoapsis, because we're a little closer than we should be, but we should be okay. So you can see the point at which we would crash is getting progressively further and further away. So basically, this is like a big circle, and we're just seeing part of it because the crash would interrupt the big circle. Let's point a little higher here. We still have plenty of fuel, and I think we'll still be able to create a stable orbit. So as we look here, you see this point going further and further, and we can point a little more down. And now all at once, this is going to become, instead of just part of a circle, an entire circle. And that's going to happen right about now. There it goes. Perfect. Okay, so another pause. So what just happened is we got enough velocity, tangential velocity here, to the point where gravity is pulling us in, but we are traveling sideways relative to the planet so fast that at no point will we crash into it. And that is what being in orbit is. Now the thing is, if you look at our periapsis here, which is the low point of our orbit, it's only 18,000 meters. So to reach a stable orbit, what you need to do is you need to get your periapsis and your apoapsis both above 70,000 meters. So we're going to again orient our craft prograde, we're going to hit play, and we're going to continue our burn here until our periapsis is above 70,000. And you can see I have made this orbit a little poorly, and our apoapsis is getting quite high. In fact, probably a little too high. Yeah. But that's how you get into orbit. So now you've officially reached orbit. Just if your periapsis was above 70,000 meters, you'd be in a stable orbit. And now I'm sure you're wondering, how do I get back home? Well, that's pretty easy. So we could stay up here for as long as we wanted, assuming our periapsis was above 70,000. But we're not about that here, so first thing you're going to do is point your craft retrograde. And all we're going to do is basically the opposite of what we just did. So we're going to burn retrograde, and that's going to reduce our ship's tangential velocity, which means that the pull of gravity is going to pull it closer to the planet, and we're going to reach a point where our orbital trajectory here takes us back into the planet. So let's begin that burn. And what you can watch for this part is your periapsis. Once that goes below 0, you know you are on an impact trajectory with the planet. So we can watch that right here. There it is. There's our impact. Now we have plenty of fuel, so I'm actually going to burn quite a bit of it to get our orbital trajectory to take us down sooner. So yeah, look at that beautiful view of Kerbin from up here. It's a beautiful planet. So let's turn that engine off for a second, see where we're at. Okay. So you don't really need, as long as you have a parachute, you don't need any more fuel after this point, so it's safe to just burn the rest of our fuel off. You can see our delta V approaching 0 as we do that, but at the same time, This impact point is coming closer because we're slowing ourselves down relative to the planet. So let's let the Terrier burn out there. Valentina having the time of her life. Good job, Valentina. Almost done burning that engine. Okay, so there we go. Perfect. So now we can safely detach this stage. What I would do is orient the craft prograde so that the stage detaches backwards so that you reduce the risk of running into it. So we're going to then press the spacebar button to destage. Goodbye! And you can see, oh, I actually did the staging wrong, so our heat shield has gone with the stage. If there was heating in the game, that would matter quite a bit, but there is not. So now, we can safely orient our craft sort of like this. And you basically want to point the blunt end in the direction of your trajectory. So in the SAS settings, that is retrograde. And now, if we look, we are approaching the planet. So we can go ahead and speed things up. We can watch our altitude begin to decrease. So we're below 100,000 meters, not 100,000 kilometers. That would be insane. And now we are approaching Kerbin while watching a beautiful sunset. Now, as for the parachute, you can usually wait quite a while to pull it. Not even 10,000, 5,000 meters, sometimes less is fine. But you approach quite quickly, so if you're speeding time like me, you don't want to do that too much. And you can see that our speed relative to the surface is decreasing as we approach it because the craft is getting into thicker air. So we'll get down to 3,000 meters and then we will pull our parachute. So that's right about, in fact, I'm going to do 2,000 because I don't like waiting for this thing to slow down. There we go. Perfect, and you can see the parachute's popped out here. It just takes a second to engage. And now our surface speed slows down to a mere, let's see, 6 meters per second. It's fine. That's pretty good. Typically, touchdowns would occur in oceans, not on land. But this is Kerbal Space Program, so nothing matters. And that's the best part about this game. And you can see Valentina in there. Is there a window? I guess there's only the one. Hi, Valentina. Safely returning to her home planet. But, oh, we are actually in the water. So you'll see we got a message here that says vessel recoverable. That means we have successfully returned the crew cabin to Kerbin. And it also means that at this point, we could go to our tracking map here, or actually our tracking station, which is here. And we could, if we click on our vessel, the fly safe one, we can recover it, which takes it back to the VAB, Vehicle Assembly Building. Doesn't really matter in this creative mode. It only matters in campaign mode, which isn't even in the game yet. So, yeah, not too important. But anyway, this has been how to build your very first rocket in Kerbal Space Program 2. As you can see after this video, the possibilities for this are absolutely endless. You can do whatever you want while keeping those basic things in mind. And you can pretty much achieve anything. One of the things I love about this game is how many different crafts you can make and how ridiculous you can get. Things can get crazy really fast, and you can just strap as many boosters as you want to a cube and make it fly, if that's what you want to do. But anyway, the fun part of this game is getting out and doing it yourself, so I encourage you to do that. I hope this video was helpful, and if you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like and to subscribe. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.